Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scott Ainsworth, Department Head of Political Science here at the University of Georgia in the School of Public and International Affairs. Thank you all for coming. We have a great presentation for our 2022 Parthemos lecture. The Parthemos lecture series is a series that we have the good fortune to manage year after year because of the tremendous generosity of two families, the Parthemos family and the Elaine and Dan Stevens family. And so my hearty thanks to them. George Stephen Parthemos served with great distinction as a professor here at the University of Georgia and also served as administrator during his time from 1953 until 1984 when he died on Christmas Day. George was a member of Phi Beta Kappa. He came to the university after completing his PhD at University of North Carolina, the second oldest university in the United States after the University of Georgia. He served as department head of the Department of Political Science from 1964 to 1965. He was the vice president for instruction from 1964 to 1971. He served as an alumni distinguished professor and received the Distinguished Faculty Service Alumni Award. He was outstanding in all facets of university life. He was particularly a great teacher. His commitment to excellence in instruction greatly enriched the intellectual life of his students, and they continues to enrich the intellectual life of the students today and faculty today here at the university. His widow, the late Georgia Parthemos, did much to assure the long-term success of this lecture series. I had the good fortune of meeting her, and she was always a dear friend. So she attended, I have in my notes here, she attended 25 years of Parthemos lectures. So the Parthemos family and Elaine Stevens and Dan Stevens, Elaine is the daughter of George and Georgia Parthemos, were special. In a recent email from Elaine Stevens, she shared some comments about her father, and I'm reading directly. He wanted to capture the curiosity and excitement in students and at the least, help them to truly appreciate our democratic process and its origins, challenges, and fragility. He hoped to inspire them to rise above politics and pursue a more noble level of citizenship, perhaps a little idealistic, but that's who he was. It is fitting today that we have an opportunity to welcome Diana Mutz. Diana Mutz is with us today to share a talk that very much fits within the vein of the goals that George Parthemos lived by and that Elaine Stevens shared with me. Diana Mutz received her PhD from Stanford University. She's taught at the University of Wisconsin and at the Ohio State University. She's currently at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research explores public opinion, political psychology, and mass political behavior, with a particular emphasis on political communication. At the University of Pennsylvania, she holds the Samuel A. Stouffer Chair in Political Science and Communication, and she also serves as the director of the Institute for the Study of Citizens and Politics. Professor Mutz has published articles in all the leading journals, all the leading academic journals. She's published 2 books with Cambridge University Press, 3 books with Princeton University Press. Her first book, Impersonal Influence: How Perceptions of Mass Collectives Affect Political Attitudes, was awarded the Robert Lane Prize for the best book in political psychology by the American Political Science Association, as well as the Doris Graber Prize as the most influential book on political communication. Professor Mutz's second book, explored deliberative democracy, creating a contrast between deliberative democracy and participatory democracy. Hearing the other side, deliberative versus participatory democracy, was awarded the Goldsmith Prize by Harvard University, and also the Robert Lane Prize for the best book, again, in political psychology. It was also lauded by the American Association for Public Opinion with a Research Book Award. In Your Face Politics, The Consequences of Uncivil Media received another Best Book Award, this time from the International Society for Political Psychology, as well as another Doris Graber Prize. Her service to the discipline is multifaceted, serving in leadership roles with the Midwest and other political associations, as well as being a former editor of Political Behavior. Diana Mutz was also a founding co-PI of time-sharing experiments for the social sciences, or TESS. This is an interdisciplinary infrastructure project that continues to this day to promote methodological information across all of the social sciences. The TESS experiments revolutionized the ways in which survey structures were implemented, and also broadened participation in them. Mutz won the Warren Matofsky Innovators Award for creating and implementing, co-creating and co-implementing this ongoing project. Most deservedly and unsurprisingly, Dr. Mutz received a Lifetime Achievement Award in Political Communication from the American Political Science Association. She was inducted as a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2008. Most fittingly, in 2021, she was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. The latter two designations are the highest honors that one can receive as an academician. So without further ado, I invite you all to join me in giving Dr. Diana Mutz a hearty welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott, for that warm introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so I can start a research presentation. And let me know if it's not on the screen. What I'm going to talk about today is the influence of Black Lives Matter on the 2020 election. But before I do that, I want to thank all the people at the University of Georgia who have worked behind the scenes to make my virtual visit possible, especially Wendy Finch and Scott Ainsworth. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person, and I hope I do get a rain check to come visit. But I must tell you, it's an extremely big honor for me to be selected as the Parthemos lecturer. I have seen who the previous Parthemos speakers have been, and I know I'm really in illustrious company here. So thank you very much for this honor. I do appreciate it. And I'm only sorry I can't be there in person. Before I go back to 2020 to talk about the election year, I want to first of all talk about 2021 and also offer my sincere congratulations to the Bulldogs, who also had quite an amazing year, as I understand it. This isn't happening at Penn anytime soon, believe me. So congratulations on your national championship. All right, on to 2020. 2020 was an absolutely crazy, tumultuous, chaotic year in most of our lives. Yes, we had the presidential election going on between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in 2020, but that was obviously only one of many, many things that were distracting our attention that year. The months leading up to 2020 election were also those of the onset of COVID-19 in the US. Roughly around March and April, things began to shut down. Obviously, this disrupted all of our lives and took many, many lives. If we look at when election day occurred relative to the outbreak of COVID in the US, you'll see that already about 250,000 people had died from COVID in the United States. And actually cases were still increasing as we approached election day in November of 2020. So all of this was going on very much at the same time. In addition, of course, COVID had secondary effects on the economy. The largest contraction of GDP in our nation's history, huge unemployment numbers, lots and lots of things to be concerned about in addition to the election itself. And then, of course, there's Black Lives Matter. A social movement that many didn't become very aware of until the summer of 2020. Black Lives Matter had actually been around for quite a while by then. It was founded in 2013. The first use of the Black Lives Matter hashtag on Twitter was following the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting of Trayvon Martin. But it wasn't nearly as highly visible at that point in time as it came to be in 2020. After that, there were more Black Lives Matter protests following the deaths of Mike Brown and Eric Garner in 2014. So obviously, this is not an isolated kind of incident. Black Lives Matter made the news once again during the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. And Black Lives Matter was part of the counter protest at that event, which attracted a lot of attention as well because of President Trump's response to it. And then, of course, in Georgia, on February the 23rd, Ahmaud Arbery was fatally shot. Now, that did not initially get a lot of attention until the video surfaced of it in May of 2020. And at that point, the video began going viral and more people were witnessing what had happened. Finally, late in May of 2020, of course, George Floyd's death while in police custody in Minneapolis prompted the beginning of protests all over the country and even internationally against police violence and racism. And this really was the biggest trigger, although obviously there were many events leading up to George Floyd's death that also called attention to it, and that also provided opportunities for Black Lives Matter to speak out against police violence. After George Floyd's death, the rise of Black Lives Matter was really quick. Hundreds of thousands of people all of a sudden were, involved in protests. The cell phone videos prompted these protests, as I said, not just in the United States, but all over the world, and not just in major urban areas of the United States, in suburbs and small towns as well. This also prompted people to go back and collect names and photos of victims of police violence who were people of color in the past in order to demonstrate that these weren't isolated incidents. And the Say Their Names posters became a popular way of publicizing just how many there had been. The streets in New York City and Washington, D.C. were painted with Black Lives Matter emblems. Obviously, this was a very high profile event going on in the United States. There was also a March on Washington. And beyond that, even if you weren't someone who participated in protests at all, it would be virtually impossible for you not to know it was going on, because it was a huge focus of media attention. If you look at the far right here, this is a plotting of Twitter posts mentioning the Black Lives Matter hashtag. And what you see is on Twitter, it actually came to a peak right around June 7th of 2020. That's when you saw the most tweeting about Black Lives Matter. I did a content analysis of more mainstream media as well. And what I found was, this was ongoing. It went, obviously, the protests went on through August of 2020. But what you can see is it peaked a little later, but also in June of 2020. All of a sudden, just a huge increase in coverage after George Floyd's death. So clearly, all this is going on at the same time. As this headline put it, in 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement shook the world. And I think that's a fair statement in that an estimated 15 to 26 million Americans participated in these protests. So this was bigger than what anybody had ever documented as a social movement on the streets of the United States. In short, just to summarize everything I've said about 2020, we had the pandemic killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. We had a severe, unheard of economic decline, severe unemployment, and at the same time, possibly the largest social movement in our nation's history. Nonetheless, when it came to the 2020 presidential election, voters remained highly predictable. And American voters usually are highly predictable, but in the midst of so many unusual things going on in 2020, many people thought 2020 would be different. Typically in the United States, around 90% of people vote for the presidential candidate of the same party from one presidential year to the next. In our panel data, where we interviewed people in October, right before the 2016 election, and then again in October, right before the 2020 election, we found very, very similar numbers. If you look on the left-hand side here, you'll see the vote in 2016. Among Republicans who voted for Trump in 2016, 90.2% of them also voted for him in 2020. Okay, so just about exactly what we usually see. Among Democrats who voted for Clinton in 2016, 94% of them also voted Democrat and voted for Biden in 2020. The only place where we see anything a little bit different going on is actually among people who voted for third-party candidates in 2016. If you look at the last row of this table, you'll see that many people who voted for third-party candidates in 2016 did not do so in 2020. Instead, they were split between Trump and Biden. However, they leaned more heavily toward Biden. So folks who previously voted for third party voted more for Biden in 2020. And we asked people about this when we noticed that there was definitely a trend away from voting for third parties. A couple of interesting quotes from voters who had voted for third parties in 2016. Voting outside of the two-party system is almost like not voting at all. A vote for a libertarian is a lost vote. Can't in good conscience vote for Trump, and a vote for the Green Party is a wasted vote. So there's an increasing awareness that we see in 2020 of being strategic about voting, of people feeling like they really can't afford to vote for a third party candidate that they know doesn't have a chance of winning the presidential election. And that, again, operated in Biden's favor. Given the huge amount of publicity and talk about political polarization in the United States, one of the things that comes as a surprise to many people is that the percentage of the American mass public who identifies themselves as independent has actually surged a great deal. If you look at this figure, the gray line on top is the percentage of independents, people who in response to being asked if they're Republican, Democrat, or independent, choose neither Democrat or Republican and say they are independent. So what we have is really an unheard of number of people out there who call themselves independent. We obviously see that a lot of them are voting for the same party's candidate year after year anyway. Nonetheless, the people who identified as independent in our panel study were more easily changed in terms of their vote choice than those who call themselves by a party label. So back to the question at hand, did Black Lives Matter actually affect the election in any way? As I've pointed out, it's really hard to change Americans' vote preferences. We have a two-party system in which people are very committed to the side that they support, and they tend to do the same thing over and over and over again. So we're not talking about changing, huge percentages of people, but did people change their vote? And if so, did Black Lives Matter have anything to do with it? There were a variety of theories offered about how BLM might have influenced vote switchers, as we usually call them. One theory was that it helped Biden because Democrats are usually perceived to have greater concern about racial justice issues. Given that Black Lives Matter was about racial justice, having it called to people's attention, many argued was going to help Biden. Secondly, people argued it was actually going to help Trump because it distracted from his failure to control COVID. And already, even though we were only 9 months in at that point, people were very, very frustrated about COVID. And the argument was that, well, at least COVID is keeping people from not focusing, at least Black Lives Matter is keeping people from focusing on COVID. A third theory that got a lot of attention shortly before the election was that Black Lives Matter helped Trump by raising people's fears about law and order issues due to the protests. So by associating liberals with street violence and so forth, and with defunding the police, the argument was it was really going to be a net benefit for Trump in the end, rather than Biden. Now, Biden didn't associate himself clearly with Black Lives Matter. In fact, many of the Black Lives Matter protesters really felt like Biden wasn't on their side. On the other hand, the Democratic Party, certainly at its national convention, worked hard to associate itself with racial justice issues, much more so than the Republican Party did. Trump was very forthright and very clear about his stance on Black Lives Matter. He saw the movement as a symbol of hate, and he basically was putting down the Black Lives Matter movement as a matter of course from the time that they came to mass public attention. Interestingly, the defund the police movement, which was linked to Black Lives Matter, was not nearly as popular as the Black Lives Matter movement itself. And for that reason, Biden really distanced himself from BLM to some extent. And many who are supportive of Black Lives Matter criticized him for that. Others, including campaign advisors, said, no, you got to back away because defunding the police is not popular, even though the movement as a whole is. Biden himself at one point complained that progressive efforts to defund the police had allowed Republicans to, as he put it, beat the living hell out of Democrats during the 2020 election cycle. So BLM leaders, as this headline says, saw Biden's attention to them as lip service, and then Biden was seen as breaking with Black Lives Matter to oppose defunding the police. So it wasn't as if this movement was clearly aligned with Biden, but it was certainly more so than it was with Trump. Many pundits and politicians and various advisors saw BLM as potentially helpful to Trump and harmful to Biden. As one editorial put it, to save Black lives, stop BLM protests. They could backfire by giving Trump a second term. Trump's law and order campaign is a distraction. And so these were folks who were in favor of Biden, saying, you got to stop Black Lives Matter. It's going to hurt Trump's candidacy. Of course, no one knew for certain in what way it was likely to affect him. But there were lots and lots of articles making it clear that he was putting distance between himself and Black Lives Matter out of fear that it would hurt his candidacy ultimately. Trump, on the other hand, embraced his law and order kind of image, arguing he would restore law and order on the streets and really relishing the opportunity to blame Biden for the street violence that took place as part of some BLM protests. This is an ad that I remember seeing when Trump was running that I'll just play briefly for you, that attempted to capitalize on people's fears about defunding the police.
You have reached the 911 police emergency line. Due to defunding of the police department, we're sorry, but no one is here to take your call. If you're calling to report a rape, please press 1. To report a murder, press 2. To report a home invasion, press 3. For all other crimes, leave your name and number, and someone will get back to you. Our estimated wait time is currently 5 days. Goodbye.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Oops, sorry about that. Okay, you get the idea. Biden responded to this law and order emphasis of Trump's by directly criticizing the violence and saying, you know, that's not me. I am not associated with that.
I want to make it absolutely clear. Rioting is not protesting. Looting is not protesting. It's lawlessness, plain and simple. And those who do it should be prosecuted. Fires are burning and we have a president who fans the flames. He can't stop the violence because for years he's fomented it. But his failure to call on his own supporters to stop acting as an armed militia in this country shows how weak he is. Violence will not bring change. It will only bring destruction. It's wrong in every way. If I were president, my language would be less divisive. I'd be looking to lower the temperature in this country, not raise it. Donald Trump is determined to instill fear in America because Donald Trump adds fuel to every fire. This is not who we are. I believe we'll be guided by the words of Pope John Paul II, words drawn from the scriptures. Be not afraid. I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
Okay, so obviously, very different language used to refer to some of the same events. And in fact, we see this very clearly on the cable networks. Protests, discussion of protests was constant all summer long across all of the networks. However, words like looter and looting or riot and rioters, those were far more common on the more conservative networks than they were on things like CNN or MSNBC. So a lot of mass attention to BLM, but very different frames on what BLM was about. So which side did it actually help? Well, in order to look at this, we did, as part of our 6-wave panel study that went clear from right before the first Trump election in 2016 to right after Biden's election in 2020, we had samples of 3,000 people that were selected using address-based probability sampling. And these people, many of them were interviewed online, but some were interviewed by phone because they did not have internet access. And they were interviewed in both Spanish and English. And one of the things that we tried to do in this panel is to repeat the same questions over time in the same order in order to see what causes people to change, whether it's their opinions about public policy issues or whether it's their choice of a candidate. In a panel study, you lose some people every time you do a new wave. So we also had fresh sample that was added over time. Between the very beginning of the panel in October 2016 and October 2020, we had a little over 1,200 people who were present in both waves of the panel. The advantages of a study where you can go back to the same person and talk to them again, is that we can actually see who changed their minds and who didn't. And we don't rely on their memories of what they did in the past. We actually have what they told us right before one election and what they told us right before a later election. So we can compare people to themselves over time rather than just looking at aggregates or cross-sectional correlations. It's very easy to look at polling data and see, oh, people who are concerned about COVID were more likely to vote for Joe Biden. Absolutely true, but very difficult to know what to make of that, because you don't know if that's why they supported Joe Biden or if they supported Joe Biden all along, and this didn't change their view at all. So panel study is extremely advantageous for purposes of figuring out who those swing voters are and why they change. Just to give you a sense of when we surveyed people, this was our timeline for the 6 different waves. The thing I want to call the most attention to are the very last 2 waves, because the 5th wave was right before COVID hit the United States. Before, we had all started staying home for work and so forth. It's also right before George Floyd's murder. So Black Lives Matter occurred in between waves 5 and 6. So the people who we have are between wave 5 and 6, we can look at in order to ascertain a whole lot of things about how those events affected people. We measured perceptions of discrimination against Blacks with a pretty standard question. We asked people how much discrimination is there in the United States against each of the following groups, and they had a list of groups. Among those were whites and Blacks. And we calculated perceived discrimination against Blacks relative to perceived discrimination against whites, so that people who have a higher score see Blacks as more discriminated against than whites, and people who have a score below 0, a negative score, think whites are discriminated against more than Blacks are. This is what we found in terms of perceived discrimination against Blacks, broken down by the race of the respondent. What you see in the big white line is that's all people. And as you notice, things are pretty flat. Nothing much changes from 2016 through 2020 until between February of 2020 and October of 2020, when COVID occurred. And what you'll see here is all racial groups, not just Blacks or people of color, increased in the extent to which they thought Blacks were more discriminated against than were whites. So we see this across the board. There are significant increases between those last 2 waves. We saw a bit of an increase also back, if you look at the purplish line, among Blacks around the time of the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. But in general, everybody across racial groups responded to Black Lives Matter and to seeing these videos, and their reaction was that Blacks were more discriminated against than they had previously thought. So it's not a whopping huge effect, but definitely an increase. At the same time, perceived discrimination against Blacks was quite different by political party. So what you see here is that Democrats were already higher in perceived discrimination against Blacks, not surprisingly, but you see a large increase on the far right side when Black Lives Matter occurred between February and October. Among Republicans, you have to look closely, but basically the red dots are the line representing Republicans. And what you see there is that basically they are on the 0 line, meaning that they perceive as much discrimination against whites as against Blacks. And it doesn't change during Black Lives Matter. There is no increase during that very same period. We do see it among independents, though. Independents definitely do increase their perceptions of discrimination against Blacks during the period that BLM gained public attention. So basically, this is something that affected people across the board racially in terms of racial groups, but not across the board in terms of political party. We basically did the same thing we'd done in the past, that is to assess people's vote choice in both, right before both elections. It was still around 10% of people who voted for somebody different than who they had voted for in the previous election. As I pointed out earlier, many third-party voters from 2016 voted instead for major party candidates in 2020. And there was also much higher turnout in 2020. So many of the people in our sample who are non-voters in 2016 became voters in 2020. So those were obvious distinctions, but it wasn't as if voting was more volatile. It wasn't as if more people changed their minds. And turnout was up among both Republicans and Democrats. Okay, just to show you what we found in real simple terms, this is the relationship between changing your perception of discrimination against Blacks and changing your vote choice in the direction on the far right toward Biden and in the direction on the left toward Trump from either voting for a third party or someone else in the previous election. And what you see is it's those who changed their perceived level of discrimination that was occurring against Blacks who are most likely to switch votes in the direction of Joe Biden. So based on this, and again, we're not talking about many people because there are only about 10% of people who switched or dropped in or out of the electorate. But nonetheless, we get a very statistically significant effect where switching your vote goes hand in hand with having changed your mind about perceived discrimination against Blacks between those two periods. In another analysis, I included new voters, meaning people, who turned out in 2020 but didn't in 2016. And again, here we find the big difference is that those who changed toward Biden were again highest in change in perceived discrimination against Blacks. And they were quite different in that respect from the non-changers in particular. People who changed toward Trump, toward the Republican side, there weren't very many of those because obviously most people defected in the other direction, which is how Biden was elected. So this bivariate relationship is suggestive, at least, of the idea that this increase in perceived discrimination against Blacks that was brought about during BLM helped Biden, at least encouraging those who are switching votes to become more likely to support him. On the other hand, as I pointed out earlier, there were so many other things going on in 2020. So beyond perceptions of race, we need to take into account all these other things as well. Obviously, people were losing their jobs. Unemployment was way, way up. People's family finances were in turmoil in many cases. So there's a lot of fear surrounding economic kinds of issues as well. Again, Trump tried hard to say those weren't his fault, and whether you believe they were, they weren't, they were real, and people were living through something they never had before, which we would think would disrupt their usual voting patterns, possibly. There was also concern about COVID. Now, interestingly, when we first started measuring concern about COVID, there was no partisan difference whatsoever in people's levels of concern. As time went by and it became more of a partisan issue, you see a divergence where Democrats express great concern and Republicans say it's really no big deal. So that did become highly partisan as a function of what the candidates were saying about COVID. There are also obviously other issues in 2020. And what I attempted to do was to look at how people's views on those issues changed between 2016 and 2020 as well. Things that were highly salient, like immigration, China, trade, and so forth. So These other issues I attempt to take into account at the same time that we look at changes in attitudes toward racial minorities. We asked another question, which is kind of a government-based question about government help for Blacks and other minorities, and about whether the US government is doing enough to help them. Interestingly, this measure operated a whole lot like perceived discrimination did. Basically, people increase their likelihood of saying the government should be doing more. And again, we saw that very similar to the pattern of perceived discrimination. This shows you both the AA in the middle is all Americans. If you look at one end of the spectrum on strongly oppose government making every effort to help minority groups and strongly favor the government making every effort to help minority groups, the average American in 2016 pre-BLM was closer to Democrats on this issue, the Democratic candidates and where they perceived them to stand, than to Trump, because obviously Trump was perceived as a new kind of Republican in his overt comments about racial minorities and so forth. Now you have to watch really carefully here because this is a very minor change, but I'm going to fast forward us to what it looked like post Black Lives Matter right before the election. Okay, you see that little thing in the middle, skip over. So basically what changed was not so much where the candidates stood in the eyes of the public, but the average American came a little bit closer to the Democratic Party because they had increased in their perceptions of discrimination against Blacks and in the need for government to intervene to help minorities. So small change, very minor. Overall, perceived discrimination increased by 4%. Perceived discrimination against Blacks. Support for government help for minorities increased by 2% overall. But if you look strictly at independents, it was about 4%. So if you look at those most likely to be swing voters, their views on government help for minorities changed to a greater extent. These changes are small, but then what it takes to change the outcome of election is also quite small. I mentioned that I wanted to incorporate other issues that were salient. Trump also took a very strong stand on China. And this question asks whether they see China as more of an opportunity or more as a threat. And same thing, immigration, whether they favor or oppose addressing immigration by providing a path to citizenship for illegal aliens. They not only were asked their own opinions on each of these, they were also asked where they saw the Democratic candidate and where they saw the Republican candidate on these issues. So what happened? Well, interestingly, when you put these into analysis where you're looking at whether change in this issue position predicts change in vote choice, what we see is that changing your choice of presidential candidate from one party to another was not at all a function of immigration attitudes, threat from China, nor healthcare, nor trade. I could keep going on and on. But of all the issues we asked about, change in those issues didn't seem at all related to changing voter preferences. We did find, however, that it was a function of changes in opinions on these two racial items. That is, changes in perceived discrimination against Blacks. If your level of perceived discrimination went up, you became more likely to switch to Biden. And the same thing in changes in support for government help for minorities. If that increased, you became more likely to switch your vote toward Biden, whether from a third party candidate or from Trump to Biden. What about COVID? Well, one of the really interesting things is almost everybody I've talked to said surely Trump's handling of COVID had something to do with the fact that he didn't win the election. And I agree, something as earth-shaking as COVID should. But part of what we see is that by the time of the election, COVID had become so politicized that it really, your level of concern reflected your politics rather than influencing your politics. The one place where we find that levels of concern about COVID did have an effect is in feeling thermometer ratings, how much you like the candidate. We find that it didn't change people's vote choice, but it did, those who were really concerned about COVID had higher thermometer ratings of Biden than we would otherwise expect them to have. And that's a measure that is on a much bigger scale than simply did you vote for him or not. So it made people who liked him like him better is basically what we find, but it didn't really change vote choice because there was so much partisan rationalization going on surrounding both the economy and COVID. What about the economy? Because obviously, you know, it took a beating as well during the summer before the election. We see clear evidence of declining family financial well-being, but it doesn't influence your likelihood of changing your vote. Losing your job didn't make a difference either. All of this, the traditional kinds of things we think of as likely to influence vote switchers seem to be rationalized. That is, if you look at how they thought the economy was doing, it reflected who their voter preference was. It was not the other way around where those things were influencing people's vote choice. In studies of electoral behavior, there are really two different ways that you can think about changing people's vote choice. And we know it's really difficult. We know even from experimental studies that changing people's minds about anything political is very difficult. But what I've shown you thus far is that really you can change people's minds on issues. Black Lives Matter and the attention directed toward BLM did move people's opinions on government help for minorities. So it changed people's minds, and that favored one candidate over another because he was already closer to issues of racial justice. Interestingly, that's not usually how people look for changes in voting behavior. Instead of looking at persuasion, the most common thing people do is look at what we call priming, meaning that people have the same positions they've always had on issues. It's simply that they weigh certain issues more heavily in one election than another. And if you happen to be the candidate who is perceived more positively on that particular issue, that can benefit you, that issue is primed. But it doesn't involve people changing their minds about issues or about the candidates at all. It simply is the calculus that they have in mind when they decide for whom to vote weighs more on some issues than others. So the next thing I looked at, beyond persuading people that, you know, racial discrimination was more of a problem than they may have thought, I also looked at priming, and both went on. Not only did people change their opinions, they also weighed these racial issues more heavily in their vote in 2020. So we have evidence of both persuasion and priming going on simultaneously. It's particularly interesting that the opinions on these other issues were not at all tied to vote switching. You know, there's no reason any election needs to be decided with one issue or that people's votes need to be changed with one. Usually elections are a function of many different things going on. But in this case, we can say that at least changing your mind on these issues didn't have an effect on changing the candidate that you supported as it did with racial issues. So Biden was ultimately the net beneficiary of what happened due to Black Lives Matter. That's not to suggest that BLM, you know, was intended to affect the election or anything like it. Like I said, the relationship between the two has been rocky, but by priming these issues, by increasing perceptions of discrimination against Blacks, and by also priming this issue to matter more in people's vote choice, it really did make a difference. That is, we can see that those people who formerly voted for the Republican but now voted for the Democrat were those people who were most likely to have changed their minds on these issues. just to be clear, that's not to say that fears of lawlessness and defund the police didn't matter to anybody. In fact, they both could have been going on at the same time, but the net gain was ultimately in votes for Biden. Did Black Lives Matter induced vote switching matter in swing states? You know, everybody wants to try to bring in the Electoral College and see how it mattered. What I have found using various definitions of swing states is that, yes, it mattered in swing states, but it didn't matter any more in swing states than it did in other states. Black Lives Matter got attention nationwide all at the same time, and we don't see influence in specific places that might have been more likely to swing the election than others. Secondly, did BLM matter more to new voters? Because we know we had a big increase in turnout in 2020. Here I find, yes, that people who are new voters who didn't vote in 2016 and then did vote in 2020 were particularly likely to be influenced by the change in their level of perceived discrimination against Blacks. So here it did seem to have a greater than usual influence on this particular group of voters. Finally, I want to get to the question of, did any of this last? We know from hundreds and hundreds of studies of the effects of political ads, the effects of social movements, and all kinds of things that the American public's attention is short. Most things that make a difference don't last very long. It's part of the reason that candidates run all their political ads right at the last minute, because they know that even if they influence you, it's probably not going to last very long. So there's been quite a bit of attention to whether or not positive attitudes toward the movement lasted, whether increased perceptions of discrimination mattered, and so forth. And the answer is maybe, maybe not. And I'll tell you why I say that. There's mixed evidence at this point. So as this graph shows you from 538, trust in Black Lives Matter declined not all that long after the election. Trust in law enforcement increased after the election. That pattern suggests probably has not been a sustained effect. However, in our own data, when we look, the last time we talked to these folks was April of 2021. And the increase that you see from February to October in both perceived discrimination and support for government help for minorities, support for government help for minorities went right back down to where it was originally before BLM. So we don't see anything sustained there. However, on levels of perceived discrimination, it's still higher than it was before Black Lives Matter occurred. And that is actually consistent with what I've seen in a number of other public data collections, suggesting that it has waned, but it's not gone. It has still some lingering effects going on. So ultimately, what's interesting about Black Lives Matter is that despite all the huge amounts of money candidates and campaigns spend trying to persuade the public, Black Lives Matter was an unintended, Black Lives Matter unintentionally benefited a campaign over another. In one sense, even if the effects on public opinion are very short, it's a persistent effect in that Biden's going to be president for at least 4 years, right? What matters is what people's opinions were like on the election day or shortly before, since many of us voted by mail and so forth. So in a sense, the effect is persistent, but even if it isn't persistent in public opinion. Will that increased awareness of discrimination against Blacks persist at all? I think the jury is still out. We see some evidence that it's still there, but at a lower magnitude. And again, it's not all that surprising given that you don't hear much these days about Black Lives Matter. It's the kind of thing where if it's in front of us continuously on a day-to-day basis, we pay attention to it, but it doesn't necessarily have long-lasting effects. It does also kind of beg the question of why aren't more social movements so well-timed, meaning that they raise the salience of their issues right before a presidential election as a means of having the candidates' views on that issue influence their vote choice. So I'm going to stop there and thank all of you for your attention and open things up for your questions.
Thank you, Diana. The way to ask a question is to use the Q&A function on the bottom right of your screen, and I will help to kind of keep tabs on some of those questions. And we already have one. Great. Okay, so this is a question about causation. So Professor Dowdy notes that respondents with the greatest change in perception of discrimination had the greatest change in favorable opinion toward Biden. That's obviously an interesting correlation. Can we say something more? Can you say something more about causation? Could
Sure.
it be that both of those changes are caused by a third factor, so omitted variable?
Yeah, anytime you do observational research, there's always a risk of that. However, the particular kind of statistical analysis that I use to analyze these data lessens the possibility of omitted variable bias, because what we do is called a fixed effects analysis at the individual level. So we don't look overall at correlations between people's attitudes and vote choice. We look at one particular individual. How does that person change relate to their change in vote choice? Now, what that does is it automatically eliminates many of the kinds of things that we usually control for because they're stable individual differences like, you know, race, gender, income. A lot of the usual suspects are not there because obviously it's the same person. So stable individual traits, whether we measured them or didn't measure them, those are already controlled for by the statistical model. What we can't control for is things that may have changed during that very same period of time that we didn't measure. We've looked at an awful lot of things, and the fact that change in so many different issues was not at all related, but this one was pretty convincing to us, since it was change in their perceptions of discrimination against Blacks. But anytime you do election work, that is always a problem. We can't do experiments on presidential elections.
Okay, we have another question up in the queue. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Do you think this election sets a tone or a precedent for future elections? And can you say a little something about polarization of parties and how that may come into play for something like Black Lives Matter and in future elections?
I try to make a practice of not predicting things, but you know, a heck of a lot is going to depend on what happens both in the midterms, especially to the Republicans, and whether or not the party splinters and so forth. Polarization has been going up for a very long time, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that perceptions of polarization are way higher than actual polarization. It is still the case, as Mo Fiorina likes to say, that attitudes on public policy issues are mostly a bell curve in the United States. Most people are in the middle. It's not the case that we have a bimodal distribution with extreme views on lots of issues. Nonetheless, when it comes to the key measure of polarization that the news media talk about, which is how much do you dislike the other side, that, and the feeling thermometer ratings, basically, how much do you dislike the other party? That has become very, very high. There's some debate in political psychology circles of what people are telling us when they say, if you're a Republican, you hate Democrats, or you're a Democrat, you hate Republicans. Part of, well, what the latest research suggests is actually they're not expressing animosity toward rank and file partisans of the other side. They're actually expressing negative attitudes toward political elites instead. And the one thing political scientists across the board agree on is that political elites have become a lot more extreme, even if the mass public has not, our elected officials have.
Thank you. You mentioned that the questions were asked in both Spanish and English. Mm-hmm. Was there a sufficiently large sample to allow you to explore differences?
Probably it would be too small between 2012 and 2016, but to look, for example, right before COVID hit and BLM hit and after, that would be possible, because of course you have more of the same people if they're, continuous waves and not 4 years apart, because we're constantly adding people as well. In perceived discrimination, we see that people of color in general tend to be higher to start with in levels of perceived discrimination, and they went up just as much as Blacks did, just as much as whites did.
So there's a question about the vote changers, and the question is, we know that, of course, that the vote changers tended to be younger, but there's also a question in the Q&A about the proportion of African-American vote changers, keeping in mind that there was a mobilization effort as well during this period, during 16 and 20.
I don't have the mobilization data so that I could say exactly, how many were mobilized. I do know that the increase in turnout was almost indistinguishable between Republicans and Democrats, that is, among those who've registered for a party. So I'm not sure on that. We linked to our survey data, we do have validated voter information, which tells us, the people who said they were going to vote one way or another, they actually did turn out and do it, because people always over-report voting to a certain extent. But I don't know the racial breakdown. I know that it's the percentage of our sample that is minority of some kind or another is quite large, and it matches the population percentage almost exactly. However, these days it's such a mix. And when you say, for example, Blacks, Black Hispanics, how are you going to count, and so we do have a multiplicity of racial categories these days, which makes it harder to make an across the board statement like that. That's part of the reason that, of course, Hispanics can also be white and identify as white as well. So I don't have a good answer for your question, but yeah, we had a large number. People are interviewed in whatever language they want, and a fairly high percentage choose Spanish. The organization that we work with does that regularly.
Okay, I think we have time for just one or two more questions. There is one question that I'm going to kind of combine a few questions if I can. But one question or issue that comes up is about racial issues in elections coming forward. And so not necessarily asking you to prognosticate about a particular election outcome, but more the role of racial issues, the next racial issue in elections. Although I must say that there are a handful of folks who are asking if Trump will be reelected. But good luck on that one. But the first part, how do we see parties using or candidates using racial issues going forward?
You know, again, we have a lot of important court cases coming up, for example, involving affirmative action and so forth. And I think at this point, it's yet to be determined what kinds of racial issues will really be at the forefront of public attention. I have seen, you know, in our data, some emphasis, I'm not sure quite how to put this, of liberals becoming disgruntled with the way their own party is handling race. And I think, you know, this is the kind of thing on college campuses we hear about all the time of to what extent are we balancing things like freedom of speech with things like having a comfortable environment for minorities as well. So we see more of that being brought up than we did in the past. So I do think that's something that Republicans have used to their advantage to some extent, because, you know, traditionally our political tolerance measures always had Democrats being the more tolerant party. Now Republicans come across as the more tolerant party because of things like racial issues and free speech being opposed more by Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, this has been a real treat for us. And so thank you, Professor Mutz, for honoring us and honoring this lecture series with your presence.
The honor has been all mine, Scott.
Well, I will say that the Parthemos lecture series is quite possibly the single most distinguished named lecture series here at the University of Georgia. And I am personally proud to add your name to that list. So
well, thank you. I'm honored to have my name on it. And I thank the Parthemos group or endowment or whatever it is you have for making all this possible. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you so much.